Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Torget. Andrew received his PhD from the University of Virginia and is a historian of 19th century North America at the University of North Texas, where he holds a university distinguished teaching professorship. The founder and director of numerous digital humanities projects, including Digital Austin Papers, which we use quite a lot, Mapping Text, the Texas Slavery Project, and Voting America. He runs a digital scholarship lab at UNT. His most recent book, Seeds of Empire, Cotton Slavery and the Transformation of the Texas Borderlands, won 12 book prizes and honors and was hailed by Texas Monthly as the most nuanced and authoritative rewriting of Texas's origin myth to date. He is currently writing a book on the rise and destruction of 19th century Galveston. He will speak about Stephen F. Austin mapping and remaking the landscape of East Texas. Please welcome Dr. Torget.
Screen right here. That's not, though. Should I turn this on? Hey! How are y'all? There we go. I can see things now. All right. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you guys for being here today. I'm really excited to be here and talking about, coming off of Dr. Smith's presentation, Stephen F. Austin and the transformations that are happening in East Texas during the period that a lot of us are interested in, the early half of the 19th century. And part of the reason I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about Stephen F. Austin's mapping and how he approaches a lot of this stuff, is that we've been working for the last several years at UNT on a digital edition of Stephen F. Austin's papers. We've been digitizing all of his writings and correspondence and putting it online. And it's been a humbling project because there's a lot of stuff in there. And it's been important in understanding just how broad an impact Stephen F. Austin had on the transformation of East Texas, the migrations that come into the region, all of that good stuff. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate in all that process is how much mapping was a part of this process of claiming the land in East Texas, and much a part of the process of claiming East Texas and transforming it. If you go through the Austin papers, right, what you see a lot of are correspondence and letters and then sketch maps of all kinds of efforts to try to understand and grapple with what does this land mean, how are we going to control it, and how are we going to turn it into what we want, right? One of the triumphs of that, and what Stephen F. Austin is most known for when it comes to mapping, is his 1830 map that was published in Philadelphia, and is a triumph of cartography for its age. I mean, Stephen F. Austin had some training as a surveyor, but he was not a cartographer by training, and without the aid of satellites or anything like that, he produces this masterpiece of mapping in this era that is incredibly accurate, is incredibly powerful in its era because it becomes a guide for migration. It becomes how people, both in Mexico and the United States, view this region, right? And for Austin, he was particularly proud of this map because, and precisely because, it represented what he thought he was trying to accomplish. He's claiming this land, and he's redeeming it, as he would put it, from the wilderness and turning it into a productive, civilized area that he hopes will then bring more people in, right? And that matters. That matters enormously, because what Austin did here in Texas, and what this map really encapsulates, is this migration and movement pattern that does transform Texas and will eventually shear Texas from Mexico, create this Republic of Texas, as we like to remind the rest of the country, we're our own nation for 9 whole years, right? And then when that gets annexed to the United States, it will remake the modern American Southwest with a war with Mexico that makes the modern border of the United States that we are still debating and arguing about today, right? So these things matter, and understanding how Austin comes to this map and what he thought it represents really does matter in a larger and broader sense. So I want to talk about that process, about how he goes about mapping and thinking about these sorts of things as a window into him and to the colonization experiment. But I also want to pull this up to show you guys there's a lot of stuff that you can't see in this map, a lot of processes that are going on that you won't understand unless you see this broader context of what Austin is choosing to represent and what he's not. And if you love this map, they have it on sale in the back in print edition for $20 from the General Land Office. All right, so to do all of that, we need to see the world through Stephen F. Austin's eyes. So that's what going to be my main task right here, is to try to reconstruct this world as Austin saw it, so that you can understand how he creates the map that he does and what he thinks it represents, okay? So, with that, the beginning context, if you want to understand Stephen F. Austin and these maps and how he saw this landscape, you need to understand the Cotton Revolution all right, of the early 1800s, and how it transforms how North Americans generally view geography and the maps and this entire region. All right? And what I always tell my students when I talk about cotton and how it transforms the United States is that you can't start in the United States. You can't start in Texas. You can't start in Mexico. You need to start across the ocean in England, all right, which was the epicenter, really, of this early cotton revolution and what it means. All right? So if you were born in the 19th century and you were alive in Austin's time, you lived in a British world. All right? Everything the United States has been since World War II, the most powerful economic, political, and military force in the world, the British were all of those things in the 19th century, which my students find kind of odd because they always say, well, isn't England an island, and a small one at that? And I say, yes, it is. But the reason it has so much influence and power is because it had massive economic power, all right? The British had a massive trade empire across the Atlantic world, and that brought an enormous amount of wealth that then translated into military power. And so much the epicenter of that British wealth, all right, is the textile industry that's going like gangbusters in the early 1800s as the Industrial Revolution is getting going and transforming really economics and politics around the world, right? You want to trace the origins of the Industrial Revolution. It's in Manchester and Preston where they have, these machines that are turning, at first, wool into textiles of all sorts. Clothes, tablecloths, napkins, whatever you could possibly want, all right? And the British have been doing this and doing this very well for quite some time by the late 1700s, making a lot of money in the process. But around the 1780s in particular, and then going forward, they start experimenting with a new fiber to feed their machines to make cloth, which is cotton, which cotton wasn't a new fiber. It had been around for a very long time. But they start experimenting with it as an alternative to wool. And they take some test batches and they sell them around Europe. And it turns out that cotton sells really, really well. Why? Because it's comfortable. It's the reason most of us are probably wearing cotton here today, right? It's lightweight and durable. It's much more comfortable than wool in the summer, in July, and pretty much anywhere in the country. More than that, though, it has another advantage, two advantages. One, you can print things on them, which means you can make them fashionable, which means you can convince people to buy them even if they already have a nice shirt or a nice dress. Once the fashions change, you can get people to buy more. And the other thing is that you can ramp up production if you can get people to grow cotton on a large scale, right? When you're using wool, there's only so many sheep in Scotland you can shear to feed your machines. But if you're going to do this on a large industrial scale, you want something like cotton that can be grown in bulk. And so around the early 1800s, the British start transitioning their machines from wool to cotton. And then in 1815, at the close of the War of 1812, they put out a call for cotton and say, basically, anyone and everyone who can grow cotton, send it here. We'll pay top dollar, or top pound, I guess, for whatever you can send to us. That means in 1815, the price of cotton skyrockets, all right? It doubles from 15 cents a pound to 30 cents a pound in 1 year, all right? You know what that produces? One of the most important migrations in all of American history, right? So you see up on this map right here, you have our tens and then hundreds of thousands of people moving down into what becomes the Mississippi River Valley. See all these arrows? These are mostly rivers. People are coming up and down because rivers are the highways of the 19th century as people are pouring down to the Mississippi River Valley to grow cotton for the British. Why? Because it's hot in Mississippi, which is great for growing cotton. You have a lot of frost-free days, right? You've got rich soils, great river systems for transporting things to New Orleans, which is a ready-made port, down over here to international markets. It's perfect for growing cotton, and people start coming down here, not because they feel like they have to move west and they want to get ahead of the curve and all of that. They're coming here because they're going to make money, and they're going to do it in the interest of their families. And so people come pouring down to the Mississippi River Valley to do this, to establish cotton farms and cotton plantation districts, right? Where you guys see this image right here. This is a plantation right off the Mississippi. You have these big fields where if you can grow that cotton, clean it, bale it. You guys see these bales right over here, 450-pound bricks of money on these things. You take them down to the Mississippi. You see the steamboat right here? Go down the Mississippi River, take that to New Orleans. If you can load a ship with cotton and send it to Liverpool, England, you can literally make a boatload of money, right? And so people who are moving down to this territory are going by huge numbers to do this. And the United States surpasses India in 1820 as the largest producer of cotton in the world. We do that in 5 years, from 1815 to 1820, all right? Now, not everybody who's coming here is coming voluntarily, of course, right? What is the labor system that makes Mississippi plantations run as they do? Slavery, right? And so 40% of the people who are coming down to this territory are enslaved African Americans, men, women, and children who are being brought to labor on these plantations. Why? Because it's profitable. Every enslaved person you can put to work on your plantation is 8 to 10 more acres in cultivation. That's an enormous amount of money, all right? And what's happening here is that during this period, you have Americans reimagining the map of the United States. They're moving from the eastern coast into what they called the Southwest. Mississippi and Alabama become states in 1817 and 1819. And they're extending the maps. This is geography at work. And their mental imagining of what the West really is. For them, in the Southwest, it's becoming a place to grow cotton. For enslaved people, this is where you start getting sent when you're being sent down the river. You ever heard that term? That's literally down the Mississippi. From Kentucky or Virginia, you're being sent down the river because 1 million people were sent from the upper South to the deep South for this, from 1820 to 1860. As these domestic slave networks are being established, that's also changing the maps, all right, as all these things are working hand in hand and in tandem. And the result is the maps that Americans imagined, that Mexicans imagined of this region are changing dramatically between 1815 and 1820. They're mental maps of this region. And so I don't know if you guys can see the numbers up there, especially in the back, but these are the populations by 1820, all right, along the U.S. Texas-Spanish border. Right? In Louisiana, you've got 150,000, 75,000 in Mississippi, 144,000 in Alabama. That's 370,000 people who have moved here, 1/3 almost all of whom have moved here in 5 years. That's how fast and dramatic the cotton revolution is, all right? And so you have this pull that's bringing people down here for very specific purposes and very specific reasons, right? Again, 40% of those people are not coming voluntarily. Every third person in Alabama was enslaved. Half of all Louisianans, half were enslaved, all right? And so this map, you guys see over here, the 3,000, this is, how many non-Comanches, basically, are in Texas at the time. So Mexico City gets nervous seeing these maps. They're worried these Americans are going to start coming over. But there's no good reason for Americans to leave the Mississippi Valley. They're very happy there. They think this is where it goes. And for them, honest to goodness, the Sabine River and the neutral ground and all of that isn't, there's a few people, but not very many people are very interested in going there because it's insecure as far as they're concerned. What they're interested in doing is staying here and making an enormous amount of money. What changes that? All right? The Panic of 1819. All right? And we talk about the Panic of 1819, collapsing financial markets and everything that went with it. That's absolutely true. But what it also did is, again, refigured the mental maps of people during this time period. And that's what's going to be crucial to understanding Austin and his efforts to map Texas during this period. Because when the financial crisis of 1819 hits, it collapses banks, it collapses finances, nobody can get money, nobody can loan money, people stop buying land. It's not that the British had stopped buying cotton, but now suddenly, if you're an American farmer or would-be farmer, or you just lost your land because the bank foreclosed, you can no longer get any money to buy land, and you're shut out. What Mississippi had now offered you is now gone, right? And this is a major problem and changes, again, mental calculations for some people. The most famous person of this, obviously, is Moses Austin, Stephen F. Austin's father, right? Who's in Missouri and had been doing very well in his lead mining operation, but he is destroyed by the Panic of 1819. His family finances, including Stephen's, are wiped out, and it looks terrible. So Moses Austin's scheme, right, to bring Americans to this region is not because he just wanted to take people to Texas, or that westward expansion was its own thing. He's coming here because he wants to resurrect his family's finances, and he sees an opportunity to extend the maps in his favor. Does that make sense? And what map is he trying to extend? Mississippi, Alabama, right? He's looking at this map, and he realizes, if I can take Mississippi and bring it to Mexico, I can bring American settlers there. That will be good for them because they need land. It'll probably be good for Mexico because they need settlers who can deal with what the Mexican government would have called the Indian problem. But in addition to that, I can make money because I will get land in this process, and that will resurrect my family's finances. Claiming land and the value that that brings is what's a motivating factor in all this. And seizing on the cotton revolution as a way to do that is what Moses Austin's idea is. So when Austin comes down from Missouri, right, he traverses this landscape, comes down the Camino Real and goes down to San Antonio. And when he does it, he's selling the idea of bringing Mississippi and cotton into Texas, all right? The Mexican leadership, well, Spanish when he arrives, and he'll be Mexican pretty soon, but the natives who live in the region of San Antonio, the Tejanos, hear all of this, and there's a long story I don't have time to go into, but their answer is, that sounds like a good idea. Why? Again, because of maps. Because the Tejanos in San Antonio, they had been to New Orleans. They traded with New Orleans. They had seen the Cotton Revolution's tremendous power to transform a region and geography, and they wanted that for Texas and all the wealth and transformation that that would provide. They also wanted more people there who would be loyal to the Spanish and Mexican government to help bolster their presence against the different Indian nations that lived in the territory and had more power than they did. So the Tejanos agree to this and then give Moses Austin their thumbs up on this. Moses Austin is so excited about this that he promptly dies on his way back to Missouri. Well, he does. And so Stephen takes over, right? And we all know that sort of basic storyline. If you took 4th and 7th grade Texas history, you've heard that. But here's what I want to emphasize. I tell all of that to give you a sense of when Austin comes into Texas, right? This is his orientation. This is the world he has in his head. This is how he's viewing things. It's not a blank slate. It's not a wide open wilderness, all right? It is land to be tamed for cotton farming. That is his orientation. And so when he comes into Texas, all right, in July of 1821, when he rides into Texas for the first time, led, by the way, by 14 Tejanos, led by Erasmo Seguin, he's being escorted in by a Tejano contingent. But when he comes in, he keeps a diary, which you can read online in the portal of Texas history. It's been digitized and was published by the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. He's making a map. Right? He's paying attention to the land and the geography and saying to himself, this is good land, this is not, this is good for farming, I'm going to skip this area over here, because he's mapping this place and trying to figure out where should he put his colony, what is that going to look like, right? And so he does that all across down to San Antonio. He gets to San Antonio, and he's very relieved that the Tejano leadership in San Antonio says, yeah, you can take over your father's grant, that's good. Why don't you get started and go find yourself some land in order to colonize? So Austin leaves San Antonio, and then he goes back east. And so this is his area. He gets to pick where he's going to go. He gets to pick the region he's going to be looking for, right? So what kind of land is he looking for? What is he mapping in his head and will later map on paper? What kind of land is he looking for? Farmland, right? Cotton lands. And all the attributes that will then be built into that, right? So he's looking for good soils. He's looking for good river systems. He's looking for Mississippi, or some variation thereof, right? And so he starts exploring east, and he settles on the Colorado and the Brazos River watersheds and all of that. And he gets in there, and he's exploring this area. He's mapping it. He's writing things down. He's making all this for his own personal benefit at this point, right? But this begins his experience with exploration in the territory. And as he goes around, he's convinced this place is amazing, and it's beautiful. And it's some of the richest soils he could possibly ask for. It's everything he'd hoped for, right? So he settles on this, claims that territory to be for his colony, where he's permission to bring 300 families, not 300 people, 300 families. And when he's done with that, he realizes, okay, I've been confirmed. I know where I'm going to go. What do I need now? People, right? I need colonists. He needs to enact his father's idea. So the way he's going to do that is he needs to change, again, the mental maps of people in the United States. So that great migration from the upper South and East Coast down to Mississippi, right? He wants to extend that here. How is he going to do that? How is he going to get people in the United States to think past the Sabine River, all right? One of the main ways he's going to do that, he's going to advertise in newspapers. And so he has to key into information networks, all right? So you got to see there's multiple maps here. There's migration maps, there's information maps, and there's migration maps of all sorts that are playing on top of each other. And what Austin is playing into are these maps of information. And the way he advertises, I always ask my students, how would you advertise this colony? Right? Google, Facebook, right? Online. And I would say, well, that's not available in this century. So what you have available to you are the newspaper networks, right? So I was explaining to them how newspapers worked in the 19th century. Any newspaper that's published here in Austin or in New Orleans or Richmond, Virginia, you'd publish your newspaper and then you'd send it all over the place, right? You'd mail it to all the major cities and you'd have people buy it in your wherever you were, in Richmond, Virginia, and travelers would take it places. But if you own a newspaper somewhere, you're buying newspapers from everywhere else. And when you get them, you're reading them for content that you can use. You're looking for the most interesting stories, whatever they might be, and the most salacious stuff, like a murder or something, that's interesting. And you're going to cut that out and put it into your newspaper, right? This is the original cut and paste. And the idea here, right, is to bring the most interesting content so people buy your newspaper. And so there's these informal information networks that spread all over the place that are built on the most interesting stuff gets reprinted, all right? So Austin knows this, and that's what he's going to key into. And so one of the things that Austin does is he starts writing letters from Texas to a friend of his in New Orleans named Joseph Hawkins, who's actually a partner in the whole enterprise. And he sends these letters to Hawkins, knowing Hawkins is going to walk down to the newspaper office and get them printed, and then they'll get reprinted, hopefully across the United States, and that'll get the word out. So Austin starts writing from Texas these descriptions of the region that are, again, him trying to reconfigure the mental maps of Americans about what this region looks like and where they should go, right? And you can read the quote right here from Austin. This is one of his many descriptions of how amazing this place is. It's basically Eden on earth, right? The richness of the soil, healthfulness of the climate, its contiguity to the sea, and other natural advantages promise Americans who come to Mexico a reward to our labors which few spots on the globe could furnish to an equal extent. This place is amazing, right? Which is exciting, but if you've read 19th century newspapers, they describe everything like this, right? Long Island, it's amazing. Florida swamps, you want this place, I promise you. Right? That's not new. But Austin had something that nobody else had, including Florida. What Austin had was the promise of 4,428 acres at a minimum, right, that you're going to get if you come here. That's 7 square miles of land, people, that you can claim for your own, which means that that's good for you and your descendants. That's like your 13th grandchild is going to still have land because there's so much of it. Thomas Jefferson would have loved this, all right? And if you bring more people, you get more land. Bring your wife, you get 200 acres. She doesn't get 200 acres. You get 200 acres. Bring your kids. It's the 19th century. You've got a lot of kids. Every one of those, you get 100 acres for them. If you have enslaved people to bring with you, 50 acres for every one of them that you get, right? Huge amounts of land that you'll be entitled to just for showing up, basically, right? More than you could ever hope to own in the United States. And that's what's key about all this. What he's saying is not just land, all right? He's saying land for cotton development. And 5 years previous to that, you've had 1/3 people, whoopsie, went the wrong way. You've had 1/3 people, right, come into this territory looking for this. This is a mild extension of that he's hoping to tap into. That's changing the mental maps of people in the United States by keying into these networks of information and how they're spreading across this territory, saying, you get more land here than you could ever hope in your lifetime, in 100 lifetimes, to have in Mississippi or Virginia or New York, for that matter, right? And so it works. The information spreads throughout these networks all over the United States. Austin is immediately flooded with people asking about his colony, and he's succeeding in changing how Americans think about this region. Because he does that, he changes the geography of Texas too. All right? These information networks have real power on the ground because they put into action another migration stream that's now coming into Texas as Americans come running in, not by the hundreds of thousands, but by the hundreds and ultimately thousands, to claim some of this land, all right? And so you have people who start coming in before Austin himself even returns to his colony. Austin goes back to Louisiana to get supplies. And meanwhile, people start pouring into this area trying to establish farms and plantations so that they can have a piece of all of that land, all right? And so there's 2 ways that people make their way towards Texas during this time period, right? Everybody came down to Louisiana because it's the jumping off point. You could come down some of the, I call them roads, the Camino Real, the Atacosito. They're more like trails than anything else in the territory here. You could come overland. Most people didn't prefer to do that. If you had any money whatsoever, you would go to New Orleans and then hop on a boat that would establish these shipping lines that start going to the mouths of the Colorado and Brazos River, because it's a lot easier to move supplies and people and all of that, because you got to bring a year's worth of supplies if you're coming to Austin's colony to see all that. That's changing East Texas, right? That's developing the roads, but it's bringing these, more importantly, these shipping lines from New Orleans. It's going to be bringing people and supplies and ultimately bringing things back like cotton bales out of the territory. That is changing the coast. That is changing the region, right? When people came in to Austin's colony, right, they would get up here to the Brazos, and then you'd go up to San Felipe de Austin, right, Austin's capital, which is basically his house for a while, and then it develops more into a town. But you would show up at Austin's colony, and he would say, great, glad you're here. Now, why don't you go find some land and then report back to me? All right? And this is how a lot of the mapping of Austin's colony really begins, is that you have his colonists going out and deciding where do they want to set up their farm, where do they want their 7 square miles of land, and then they'll come back to Austin's headquarters in San Felipe and report on that, right? And then Austin will write it down, and then you've got the development of Anglo claiming of land, and then claiming that through mapping as a way of legalizing their claims to this territory. One of the best examples of how successful this is this gentleman up here whose name is Jared Gross. Right? And Gross is exactly the kind of person that Stephen F. Austin wanted, that his father, Moses Austin, was thinking about when they proposed this entire idea. He's a Southerner. He's a Virginian by birth. He goes through South Carolina in the early 1800s, makes his way to Mississippi, actually Alabama, in 1818, all right? So he's a part of that Cotton Revolution's expansion. And he built up a lot of wealth, had almost 100 slaves by the time you get to 1819 when the panic happens. And then just like Moses, he is destroyed by the panic of 1819, all right? And he's afraid he's going to lose his investments in slaves and his lands and all of that. So when Austin's advertisements show up in the newspaper, Jared Gross says, that sounds fantastic. I'm going to head west. And he's changed the mental map that Jared Gross has of where cotton can be grown on North American soil, right? And so Gross comes in with a caravan of 50 wagons. He brings 90 slaves with him and his entire family. They come down the Camino Real, which is the northern kind of boundary line of Stephen F. Austin's colony, come down the Brazos River, go to San Felipe, and then Stephen F. Austin says, go find wherever you want to set up your plantation, and Gross does it further up the Brazos. This is Gross's plantation up here, not too far from Washington on the Brazos. And that's the process by which a lot of this land is being mapped and claimed and understood during this time period. This is Theodore Geisel, I'm actually saying his name wrong, but Gentil, I think, painting of surveying in Texas in the 1840s called Stick Stock. And it documents one of the few visualizations we really have of this act of surveying the landscape and trying to understand where it is and what you're trying to claim. But settlers are doing this all over the place, up and down the Colorado River, up and down the Brazos River, claiming, exploring, and deciding where they're going to go. And what they're trying to build is this, right? This is a Texas plantation from the 1840s, but it's a stand-in very well for the 1820s. This sketch was done by a guy named William Bollert, who was a British traveler through Texas. And it gives us a good sense of what Gross and everybody else was trying to create. This is the big house of this Texas plantation, right? Which is a wooden log cabin, right? And this is how they claimed the land. They would come in, they would tear down trees in the territory. What they would do is, you can see these stumps right here, right? These are trees that have been cleared as they're opening up cotton fields. They wouldn't chop down all the big trees. What they would do is they would cinch them, which is where you basically cut off, you strip away the bark around the base of a tree, which is its circulation system, and the top of the tree will rot and eventually fall over, and it's a great way to clear large fields over time. But this is them claiming the land, taking it and changing it in terms of the environmental structure of the territory toward cotton farming, towards plantation agriculture, towards a certain kind of geography that they're trying to create and codify and build out, right? And as they're building all of this, they're trying to claim it for their own. They're also bringing enslaved people with them. And this is, again, extending and changing the maps in the territory. Because if you're bringing Mississippi to Texas, you're also bringing the labor system that was making that profitable in Mississippi. That was Moses Austin's plan. That was Stephen F. Austin's plan. And they get into lots of fights with the Mexican government about it that I don't have time to talk about, unfortunately. But the end result is that slavery is there at the very beginning, all right? 1825, when they do the first census of Austin's colony, 25% of the people in Austin's colony are enslaved men, women, and children. Every fourth person, right? What does that mean? It means a lot of things. For what we're talking about right here with maps, it means that that domestic slave trade with the United States is being extended into an international slave trade. You have people who are being brought from Virginia, sold down to Natchez in Mississippi, taken to New Orleans, and then sent to Mexico. This is an international expansion of the slave economy in the United States that's supporting Austin's colony as the very epicenter of all of it, because it is at the epicenter of the Cotton Revolution that is transforming this entire territory. So it's displacing all these people, right? Forcibly. And it's also displacing Native American groups who live in the territory as well. Austin doesn't find a blank slate of wilderness, as we often describe, or he often described, right? There are peoples who lived there already, most famously along the coast, the Karankawas, right? Who were there to greet Cabeza de Vaca when he washed ashore in Galveston Island. And they'd been there for a long time, and they were still there. And so when Austin gets there, his settlers who are exploring and bringing supplies up and down the rivers get into fights with Karankawa groups, bless you. They load supplies that are coming from these New Orleans shipping runs to the mouth of the Brazos in Colorado, where Karankawa groups would sometimes raid and sometimes kill guards of all of that. And so as these new networks and these new maps are being layered over existing peoples and their existing maps, which Dr. Barr talked about earlier today, we have to remember these things are happening on top of each other and they're influencing one another, right? And so Stephen F. Austin comes to decide that the Karankawas cannot stay in his colony, that he and his colonists are claiming this and that it has to be theirs. And so he puts together a militia that ultimately chases Karankawas south and westward out of the bounds of his colony. And so the Karankawan people are being pushed out by this process of claiming land. All right? As the Anglos are claiming it for cotton, they're pushing out this particular group as it's making its way west and south, and ultimately will not have that same presence in Texas that it had, right? A similar story is true for the Tonkawas on the northern part of the colony. They were on the northern third, I'd say, of Stephen F. Austin's colony. And so Austin and his colonists got into fights back and forth, usually over horse stealing that Tonkawa bands would do, and Austin got into fights with them. He couldn't put together a large militia to just chase out the Tonkawas. That wasn't going to work. But their back and forth and some of the fights that happened as a result of that did push the Tonkawans northward above the Camino Real, which is, again, the northern boundary of Austin's original colony boundaries. And so you have the Tonkawans themselves also being pushed out as a part of this claiming of land process that's changing maps and changing the territory, right? And so by the time you get to the late 1820s, what you have is that the Karankawas have been pushed out, the Tonkawas have been moved forward, and this area has been solidified. This is Austin's colony right here, as dominant Anglo territory with enslaved people being brought in from this region out here, transforming the eastern edge of Texas and maybe the northern edge of Mexico in the process, with all of these connections to the United States and trade routes coming from New Orleans and migration patterns happening up and down the roads. All of that is changing mental maps and physical maps and the lived experience on the ground, all right? And within Austin's colony itself, that's his business, mapping and claiming and writing down who owns what, according to the Mexican government and the records that Stephen F. Austin is keeping in his log cabin in San Felipe de Austin, right? He is sending out surveyors. He's doing some surveying himself of all of this territory, because you're going to claim 7 square miles of land, but so is he, so is he, so is he, so is he. You got to keep all that straight. And so he's sending out surveyors and doing some surveying himself of all of this territory. And it's an enormous amount of record keeping to keep up with. One of the ways that Austin does this is that he will eventually put together, or start the process, I should say, of putting together a massive connected map, as it's called, of his colony, which shows the geography of everywhere in his colony that had been assigned to all these different people, right? And it's one of the real treasures of the General Land Office. It's an amazing map. It's a massive piece. It was on display not too long ago, I believe at the Whitty in San Antonio, and I believe in Houston as well. It's an absolute amazing map because it demonstrates the geography of all of this. But you can see how they carved up the land, right? Most everybody got some waterfront, because that's the highway of the 19th century, these rivers. This is the Brazos. And J.P. Cole's right here. This is his land. You get a little waterfront, and then you got these rectangles that come back from there. Asia Mitchell, S. Carter, J.B. Bailey, William Roberts, and so on and so forth. Stephen F. Austin, as you can see, is doing pretty well for himself, right? And there's our good friend, Jared Gross, right? These wealthy landowners start compiling land, and the Austin family did it tremendously well, which was Moses' idea originally. Because you got 7 square miles of land, and that's not free, though, right? You don't have to pay for the land. But somebody's got to map it for you. Someone's got to give you a deed to it and claim it. And so Austin does all that for his colonists for 12.5 cents an acre, right? Which is a heck of a deal. And federal land in the United States went for $1.25 an acre, so it's a really good deal. But most of the people couldn't pay that in cash, so what Austin would do is he'd say, well, just give me half your land. You've got 3.5 miles of land, still more than you could possibly use, and I'll just take the other 3.5 and I'm good to go. And a lot of people did that. And so the Austin family consolidated enormous amounts of land holding as a result of this. They became very land rich. Here's another portion of the connected map, which is so big I couldn't possibly show it on the screen. So I'm showing these images of it. But there's Steve. There's Steve's place right there. Right? And there's Henry Austin, his cousin. Henry Austin, his cousin. Henry Austin, his cousin. Henry Austin, his cousin. Poor GM Patrick. He's like stuck between them. Right? This is claiming land, and it's legitimizing it in maps away from the native groups who had them. And the Mexican government says, we stand behind this. That's what makes this process of claiming land all about mapping. And why Stephen F. Austin felt so strongly that mapping was so central to the success of his enterprise, right? He also wanted to show these new networks that are being established so he could explain to the Mexican government why this is a worthy investment. All right? He's not claiming this place for the United States. He never planned to claim it for the United States. He always talked about himself as a loyal Mexican citizen. He did everything he possibly could up until the mid-1830s to try to show Mexico not only how loyal he was, but what a service he was providing to the Mexican nation. And these maps demonstrate that. This is San Felipe de Austin, the capital of his colony. What is it? It's a hub of networks, of people, commerce, information coming in and out, moving all these different directions. It's bringing wealth and prosperity to a region that had been languishing since the Spanish arrived in the 1690s and made permanent settlements in the 17 teens. He's saying, I'm able to make this happen. You want to support this, right? And so by the late 1820s, Austin's colony really has been a runaway success. He settled his original 300. He got several more grants to settle more people. By 1830, about 10,000 people who are living in the Texas colonies, give or take, which is an enormous accomplishment all by itself. And you see all these accomplishments of that. Road networks, trade networks, people moving back and forth. It's a massive undertaking that's done an enormous amount of good. But again, to legitimize it, Austin recognizes that he must map this and advertise this as a way of being able to codify what he's accomplished and continue the migration stream from the United States. That was the battle he had uphill all the time. We often think that people just ran to Texas because it was free land, and we all know how beautiful Texas is. Why wouldn't they go? The reality is, Austin spent so much time having to convince Americans to come here, having to convince them it was safe, it was a worthwhile investment, that they could do this and they could get the benefits from it. That's what was so hard about his colonial enterprise, is he's always swimming upstream against Americans' doubts about leaving the safety and the borders of the United States, the protection of the United States Constitution. He has to convince them to move out of there. And so building maps were a way of convincing them and convincing the government of Mexico City in order that they needed to support this entire enterprise. Right? So I want to emphasize to you, and something I've become convinced of as editing the Digital Austin papers, is how central mapping is a part of claiming land and documenting these transformations, and is not just a exercise for Austin in trying to explain, look, I did something really neat. Want to see a picture? It is about demonstrating both the value and then convincing people they need to support that. These are, I don't call it propaganda, but these are actionable pieces that he's creating, all right? And you can see it throughout his career. So early in the colonial enterprise, Austin goes to Mexico City in 1822, 1823, when Mexico is forming its national constitution, and he's trying to get his colonization grant that his dad had been given legitimized. So he goes down to Mexico City, spends about a year there, trying to convince Mexican legislators to support all of this. And one of the ways he tries to do that is he makes maps. Most of these legislators had never seen Texas, just knew it's a faraway province, and he wants to explain, here's what's happening, here's what my colony can do, this is why you want to support this, because it will help us solidify our claims to the territory, not just from the Comanches, but also from the United States. So here's a map that he drew in 1822, right? This is one of the first and most accurate maps of Texas that he draws from memory in Mexico City. And this is the Brazos and the Colorado rivers. This is his colony right here, right? This is the Galveston Bay. And he's trying to demonstrate, this is, the Red River and the Sabine right here. He's trying to demonstrate to Mexico and legislators, like, how close we are to the United States, what good this would possibly do right here, and you want to support this enterprise. He attached that to petitions that he sent up the line in Mexico City trying to get his colonization proposals solidified. Meanwhile, back in Texas, in his colony, the main thing is legitimizing all these land grants that are going out, documenting them up and down and left and right. And so as a part of that long-held process that's going on, Austin employs a whole team of surveyors who go out up and down the river systems, mapping all of this. And it's one of the reasons that the 1830 map that Stephen F. Austin produces is so incredibly accurate, because he had so much information about all these different river systems and all these different locations, because he has to. He has to have people moving out there who are producing these accurate maps that he can then build on to create larger maps to give a sense of scale and proportion of the transformations that he's making possible. And so he's getting all that information back to San Felipe, where he's compiling it, right? Austin also was a pioneer of surveying the Texas coast. Between 1825 and 1826, he goes down to Galveston Bay and Galveston Island, and he maps the entire area, the most accurate map we'd had by any means up until that point, writes an entire report on that, sketches of all sorts, sends that up the line in Mexico. And he's trying to establish a port in Galveston, because he knows that'll be a great cotton trading port that will rival New Orleans. And he's right about that. It just won't happen until after the Texas Revolution. But he is mapping with a purpose. He is trying to use this as a part of claiming territory and convincing people of things. And so he sends a report to Mexico, or to the Mexican government, saying, this is an incredible bay. If only we could settle here. And if only we knew more about the coastline generally, because we could establish so much here. If only somebody would authorize this. He's trying again to convince people, right? He also compiles information from everybody who's in the territory he encounters, right? So he knows his colony, obviously, the best. He knows the places like Galveston that he's mapped himself. But he doesn't know what is then considered West Texas, the areas around San Antonio, La Bahia, later named Goliad, all those areas out there where he compiles information. He did ride out to San Antonio and back many times, but he compiles some of these sketches and maps. And if you go through the Austin papers, you can see these drafts of his understanding of the landscape, that he's taking ideas and information from different people and sketching it out. This is a map from 1827 that Austin did of the areas around San Antonio. All right? And what you can see are in prototype form, him putting all of this together in a way of claiming the land and understanding the landscape, which will culminate ultimately in his 1830 map masterpiece. And that's an important thing for him. He promised the government in Mexico City that he'd create a map, but he also knows, again, this is going to be key to convincing Americans that this is a stable enough place that you can come. He wants to show them visually that that's true. And so Austin starts compiling in the late 1820s all the information and starts putting together his map, which he plans to have published. And one of the sources he gets a lot of information from that helps him develop one of the more accurate maps we could possibly hope for from this era is information from travelers like Manuel de Muerte, right? Which I'm sure for those of you who are very familiar with Texas history know, Terán had been sent by the government of Mexico City to survey the Anglo colonies because Mexico City was worried that things were spinning out of control, right? They were right. But they send Terán up there to document it. And Terán's official reason for being there is to survey the border with the United States, again, mapping. But his secret mission is to make a report on the colonies and what's going on here, and can we continue this? And Terán, he's an amazing figure. He really is. He was a true scientist of his age. He's a true Mexican national. He's a war hero for Mexico. He's a really upstanding individual. And when he comes into Texas, he's doing what a lot of citizen soldier scientists from his era, much like Thomas Jefferson, he's making notes of all sorts and observations that he will then use long term. And one of the things that he does is he comes to Texas, he's mapping. He's mapping the region and trying to improve the knowledge of the territory. He brings with him, as Terán comes in, an 1826 map by a guy named Fiorenzo Galli, with the first published map, standalone map of Texas from 1826. So he beat Stephen F. Austin by 4 years. This is an image of the map. It's an okay map. It's not terribly accurate. It is in its generalities, but not in any of its particulars. But it's important because this is what Manuel de Muerte uses when he comes into Texas, and he makes a lot of notes on it about what's wrong with it. And so when he comes in, this is a manuscript map at the University of Texas with all kinds of corrections. You can see all the stuff that's written here. Nope, 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 over here, nope. Draws all kinds of stuff over there. Tehran, again, he's making these observations, and then he gives a lot of that to Stephen F. Austin, right? So one of Austin's collaborators is a guy sent to spy on the colonies in creating this map. But Tehran and Austin built up a real powerful friendship during this time period. They really respected each other. And Austin's very glad to take as much as Tehran's willing to give him. Apparently, Tehran never shows him the actual map, but he gives him a lot of information that Austin then uses and incorporates into everything else that Austin has been creating, right? And so the result of that is that by 1830, Austin, actually by the spring of 1829, Austin has finished his map, this 1830 map, which you can buy in the back. And the map is an incredibly accurate, it's a real masterpiece of cartographic art from this period. The river systems are incredibly accurate. All right, the coastline is very well mapped. The course of the Rio Grande, which is not the border of Texas, is not quite right. But as a general rule, it is tremendously accurate. It is a shrine to all this information that he's bringing in during this time period. And is the culmination, and I want to emphasize this to you guys, it is the culmination of everything that we've been talking about. Austin's imaginations of this region and then his experiences in the territory that are then codified in what he thinks is a triumph, which it is, right? It's published in 1830 in Philadelphia, and it becomes a best-selling map. We don't have those anymore. But it's a best-selling map. People can't get enough of this map. They publish multiple revised versions of it. That's not really much revisions. They're just stamping a new year on it. But it sells out and sells out and sells out as people are fascinated and interested in the story of Texas, in migrating to this region and becoming a part of all of this. And Austin wants to hold this up as this is a great place to come. Look at the networks. Look at the stability we have, right? We've got towns here. We've got San Felipe. Where we are, San Felipe de Austin. We've got Brazoria down here. We've got Harrisburg, not far from modern-day Houston. We've got all these road networks coming in and out. You can just land on the coast and come on up, or hop on a wagon in New Orleans. You can make your way into this territory. You can be a part of this, and you too can claim this massive amount of land for you and your children and their grandchildren. All of that is possible, right? But what's left out, of course, are all these other networks and these peoples, and these processes that made that map, right? This is Austin's vision, right? But it obscures in many ways some of the things that we know are happening that he's not as interested in demonstrating, right? It obscures the moving of the Karankawas and the Tonkawas out of this territory, the international networks that bring slavery and then cotton also itself out of the territory, and the information networks that make all of that possible. You don't see those things in the map. Some of them are implied with the road networks. Some of them are implied with the towns and their prosperity. But they're not there to be seen because that's not the purpose. This is a map with an argument to make. And it makes it very effectively, right? So Austin thinks this is going to be not just a triumph, but a beginning of a new migration stream into the region. And that doesn't happen, at least not the way he thinks it's going to happen. Because the same gentleman, Manuel de Muerte, who helped make his map so accurate in certain respects, also writes a damning report about the colonies and the Anglo migration into the region during the late 1820s. He sends his report down to Mexico City where what Tehran says is basically, we're losing Texas. He literally says it like that. We're outnumbered as far as Anglos to Mexicans in the territory, about 10-1. The Anglos are not paying attention to our laws. They're not listening, and we're going to lose the territory. All right? He makes a recommendation. We've got to stop American immigration into Mexico during this period if we want to save Texas. We have to change the map. And we have to change how Americans see the map once again. All right? So Mexico City passes the law of April 6, 1830 as an effort to do exactly that and to close down the border and to try to stop this migration stream. It's not successful, and we could talk forever about that. But the point is, this begins a process by which battles between those who live in Texas, and I don't mean just the Anglos, I mean the Anglos and the Tejanos in Texas, with Mexico's national government in Mexico City begins, and it's already been going on, but really amplifies from 1830 to 1835, 36. And the result of that is that Texas secedes from Mexico. It's not the only region to revolt in 1835 and 36, but it's the only one to succeed in its revolution. And it revolts in 1836. And so Austin's map, this triumph of 1830, will be redrawn starting in 1836. And what you will have are new migration streams, new peoples claiming land, claiming territory, codifying it in maps, and saying this is a new kind of place. And they'll create a republic of Texas that will last for only 9 years until ultimately it's joined to the United States and the North American maps are changed forever. So all that comes back to here, to Austin, and this process of understanding mapping and the land itself. So thank you guys. I appreciate you listening to me.
We have a couple minutes for questions. The only thing between you and lunch is your questioning. So,
Not me, your questions.
fire away. Please wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I'm curious to know if you can state any statistics on cotton exports out of Texas.
I certainly can. Are you a plant? That was too easy. So 95% of the exports from the Republic of Texas were cotton. 95%. The next biggest export out of Texas during the Republic period, and we know this because they kept kind of shoddy records, but still records of exports from the region, are animal hides. So 95% of the exports from Texas are cotton. That makes Detroit's economy look amazingly diverse by comparison, right? They basically have one thing, and that's the only thing. And that is true from the earlier period. They're not growing sugar. They will in the 1850s, but they don't grow sugar because it requires too much capital investment, and there's just not a lot of that to go around in Texas to be importing what you need to really do sugar development in the region. So it's almost exclusively cotton. And if you're interested in those numbers, I happen to write a book called Seeds of Empire, which my mom says is her favorite book ever. So if you want an endorsement, there you go. That has a lot of statistics, both during the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1840s about cotton production in Texas. And in the 1850s, by the way, we surpassed Mississippi in cotton production. We become the leading producer of cotton in the United States. We are still that to this day by 1850s. It's us in California usually vying for that title, but we still produce more cotton than any other state in the entire United States. I saw cotton bale when I was driving down here this morning. Yes, sir.
Andrew, a lot of the Austin's map making and a lot of the earlier map makers at the time ignored pretty much anything north of Nacogdoches. You show Pecan Point on your map, but
Right.
not any of the roads. What was their view of Northeast Texas at the time? Did it have any importance at all?
Well, it does in the sense that it's a conduit out of like Arkansas, right, into Texas, northern Louisiana. They're well aware of Pecan Point, right? That had been a settlement point back into the Spanish era. But they're aware of it, and they're interested in spreading out to those territories. Austin mapped what he knew best, right, which is his colony and the areas that fed it. And they're aware of settlement up in that area. But what you have are native nations who are more powerful, Comanches, Wichitas, and Caddo groups that are in that territory that they're not ready or willing to challenge there. And when you have other impresarios who try to do what Austin did, and they fail usually spectacularly, East Texas and going around the area around Nacogdoches, right, is one of the more famous Hayden Edwards' debacle over there of why that's hard. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating about Austin. He demonstrates that this is not an easy process. You don't just show up and say, we've got land and Americans come in. Austin wishes that it were that easy. You read his writings or those of any other impresario, and you realize how difficult this was and how much of a struggle it was to convince Americans that it's safe to go here. So when we see these maps, it's not a, look what I did, I'm documenting it. It's a, look what's here, please come. It's safe for you to come. And documenting as much as they can, including northeastern Texas, would have been as much appeal to them as they possibly could. But there's not a lot of travel that's going that direction during that period, so they don't have as much information.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Hi. First of all, I would like to thank you for your presentation. I feel like it was incredibly valuable as insight for
Thank you.
Austin's motivations. Also, I feel that as this nation develops, it's imperative that we revisit history and potentially the disillusionment surrounding our claim to these lands. And so my question to you is, well, I guess there's, Austin was pretty revered by his people, and to this day, he's seen as kind of the father of Texas. There's some irony in the fact that the hotel we're holding this in is named after him. So what I'd like to ask is for Austin, and I guess people like him, but more specifically him, when we're discussing him as historians and perhaps for some of us teachers, is there a better way to portray his efforts and motivations in a way that casts light towards his efforts in colonizing these lands?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question. I'll just tell you what I do in my classroom, right? So I teach the Texas History Survey every semester at UNC. We meant for that to happen. So I talk a lot about Austin. I talk a lot about this effort. And what I always tell my students is the best way to deal with history is just to be as open and honest about what it was. And I try to do that by exposing the way the world looked to Stephen F. Austin or Jared Gross or the enslaved people or the perspective of the Caddos or the Comanches as they're dealing with these problems and questions, right? Because a lot of my students will walk into the classroom and just want to, knock down and say, oh, they're all terrible people, everybody who lived before me. And I explained to them, in 100 years, people are going to look at you and me and say, you terrible person. I can't believe you did X, Y, or Z. History has a lot of lessons to teach, but I think the most powerful one is empathy and trying to understand the world as people saw it from that era. So instead of saying Austin is all good or all bad, I don't think you're suggesting that. But what I tell my students is, let's see the world as Austin saw it so you can understand the logic behind how he made decisions. And then the implications of what those decisions really meant, right? So we talk about, that's why I make a big deal about the cotton economy and slavery and all of these context points. Because when I took 4th and 7th grade Texas history, there was none of that there. And so what Austin did didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Land, I like land, go, okay. Why are they fighting about this? And so when you do that, though, you have to bring in the complexity about the cotton lands, about slavery, about those implications for all those different people. And as a result, if you can see these things from different perspectives, I think you get a much deeper understanding of the world of what's possible, what's expected, and what that really means in practice. Because we'd like to say Austin should have said no to slavery, which he should have, I know, but we want to be able to say, like, he would treat it the way you and I would treat it now in the 21st century. And Austin struggled with slavery mostly because when it was being outlawed at different points by Mexico, he thought it was going to imperil his colonization effort. But at the end of the day, he was kind of, he made practical choices that we can judge him for, but you have to understand the context in which they happen. Much like Thomas Jefferson and his attitudes towards slavery, the man who could write, all men are created equal, who then still owned slaves and freed none of them, or almost none of them. Some of the Hemingses did get freed, but as a general rule, that's a complex person, and that's a complex moment. And I think it's important for us to take those on their own contexts and understand the depth of the complexity. Problem is, that's complicated, and that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, and that's not easy to do. But I think that's what the joy of history really is understanding the depth of these people and the world in which they live, which is different than yours and mine, but it has a lot to say about today and the kinds of choices that we are confronted with in similar circumstances, where there's no easy answers. There's no obvious white hats and black hats in certain circumstances, that you have to understand the breadth of what's possible, and you have to understand what's before you and make choices accordingly. Anyway.
Time for one more, then we're waiting on lunch.
Yes. Okay, so the question is, when Austin made his 1830 map, what source maps did he refer to? Austin was, I think, generally aware of how few, he's the one really doing some of the earliest mapping of Texas. The Gali map from 1826, he did not have a copy of that we're aware of, because he said his map was the first map of Texas in 1830, so he seems to be unaware of that. Most of what he's basing this on are his own sketches and his own information, and he's compiling it fairly from scratch. He doesn't have something to build off of. He was aware of other maps and people who'd gone through the territory, like Pike when he comes through. The General Land Office uncovered, using the Austin papers, his influence. Say what? You may have seen the Walker maps as well. You might have seen the Walker maps. But as a general rule, he's basically creating these things himself, which is one of the reasons it's really a remarkable accomplishment of what he's able to put together.
Sorry to add something to it. I was wondering if you've run across anything with Jean-Louis Bernier.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Perhaps Lieutenant John Thompson of the Mexican Navy.
Yes.
And also, I was wondering how much Tanner had to do with some of that, too.
Tanner just got stuff and printed it, and then refused to let it be printed in what we're going to be talking.
He had to kind of put it in the coordinates.
Yes.
Tanner probably did some of that.
Yes. Well, he's basing that off of Austin's sketch. Austin's setting up the coordinates and setting things accordingly. So to answer your question, there are a couple of sources out there that he's probably pulling a little bit from, but my overall emphasis is he's doing most of this himself, right? He's building this off of his own materials, and he is grabbing some influences, but not really much. I mean, there's just not much available to him. And we don't have anything, I should say, at least in the Austin papers that I've seen thus far, that would indicate that there's any major influence outside of that. And he's so darn insistent that his is the first map. And he was the kind of guy who wouldn't just make that up and hope that nobody caught him on that sort of stuff. That I take him a little bit at his word, having read so much of his stuff, that he at least feels that he's done most of the cartographic information, despite gathering from so many other people. I mean, he owes not just to these other maps, but really the people on the ground surveying within his colony, Tehran, others like that, who are influencing what he's putting together. Anyway, thank you guys for listening to me. I look forward to lunch. So.